One topic we haven't addressed yet under the customer interview category is how important it is to verify that your customer has a compelling reason to buy. That's what we'll talk about in this video, and we'll go through some questions that you should be asking to verify that there is actually a compelling reason to buy. And at the end, by the way, I'll tell you how to get your name on a list to receive a list of questions we're working on to give you a very complete starting point for your customer interview process. So stay tuned for that. Hi, I'm Steve Morris, and I use this Startup SOS channel to provide practical how-to advice for first-time entrepreneurs. So we have suggested that the customer interview is very important for validating some of the core hypotheses in your canvas around especially value proposition, customer relationship, channel, revenue streams. In other words, pretty much everything on the right-hand side and the middle of your canvas. But there's one other critically important thing that you do need to verify, and that is that the customer actually has a compelling reason to buy. Because it could be that you're totally right about all your hypotheses that are on your canvas, and customers still might not buy. So why might they not buy? Well, it could be that even though you're right about all your hypotheses, that the priority of the job that you're addressing isn't high enough, or the dissatisfaction level isn't high enough, or the combination of the two just isn't a compelling enough reason for the customer to actually make a change. Or another option, of course, is they can't afford to pay for it. Now, we're going to put off that question later until we talk about revenue streams and how much customers will pay. Let's zero in on this not enough priority or not enough dissatisfaction. So any customer, whether it's a consumer customer or a business customer, any customer is dealing with a lot of different jobs to be done, a lot of different challenges and problems. And each of those jobs will have some perceived level of priority or importance and a perceived level of dissatisfaction. Now, the trick is, what happens if the job that you've identified is maybe a high level of dissatisfaction, but a relatively low priority? Well, if that's true, it's not that likely that your job is going to get addressed. There's not necessarily a compelling reason to buy if there are other higher priority jobs that really do need to get addressed because there's some level of dissatisfaction. On the other hand, maybe it is a high priority job that you've identified, but the dissatisfaction level actually is relatively low. Again, you could be totally right about your business model canvas hypotheses, but still, it might not be compelling for the customer to buy a solution because the dissatisfaction just isn't high enough compared to other things that they're dealing with. Now, the worst of all cases would be to identify a job where the priority is low and the dissatisfaction is very low compared to other jobs that the customer is dealing with. Well, that makes it, of course, very unlikely that they're going to address that job and spend any money on it. So your goal, of course, in the best of all worlds, would be to identify a high priority, high dissatisfaction job that really needs to be improved. That's a scenario where the customer really is more likely to be motivated to actually spend money to get a better solution. So high dissatisfaction, high priority. Now the trick is, how do you figure that out? And the challenge is, you can't figure out where your job lays on that dissatisfaction priority space by just talking about the job that you're focused on. You have to understand the context. In other words, the dissatisfaction and the priority of the other jobs kind of surrounding or related to the job that you're addressing. And so that takes a broader set of questions in your customer interview. So let's start with the question of priority. To have a compelling reason to buy in a business-to-business situation, again, assuming your customer is a business as opposed to a consumer, you want to ask questions about company priorities. You want to understand the overall industry value chain, how this industry basically works, so you can put their challenges into context. You'll need to understand their decision-making process, and you'll need to understand the decision-making roles, who has what role in the decision-making process. If you understand all of that, you've got a pretty good understanding of the relative priorities on the one hand, but also the decision-making process, which gives you some insight as to how much dissatisfaction is too much, such that they're motivated to actually make a change. Now let's dive into a couple of these in a little more depth. So company priorities. At the corporate level, at the company level, what are the challenges that they're facing? Are they regulatory challenges or competitive challenges? Do they have difficulties with their technology? Or do they have challenges with customers, like in particular customer retention? Those are good questions to be asking, again, at the company level. And whether it's a business-to-business customer or a consumer customer, you'd like to understand the decision-making process. By understanding the decision-making process, you can get a better feeling as to whether the dissatisfaction level that they have with the job being done, which is something that you'll find out about as you test your business model canvas, right? But is that dissatisfaction level high enough? Well, if you understand their criteria and their process, you'll have some insight into that. So, starting with process, what is their decision-making criteria when they're looking at a decision on purchasing the kind of product that you will be delivering? What are the functional requirements, the actual specs, if you will? Are there certain emotional requirements? Most purchase decisions really are fundamentally emotional at the beginning. People buy the product that feels right from the company that feels right. They certainly do some due diligence to make sure it's a wise decision. But a lot of purchasing behavior starts really with sort of that emotional gut feel. So what is the underlying emotion in this decision process in the company? It could be something as simple as, if I make the right decision here and deliver the right value to the company, I'll get promoted. That's sure going to make me feel good. So those are good things to understand. Then there are social requirements. Suppose the company is committed to saving the planet, committed to sustainable processes. Well, that's good to understand. It'll be important then for your solution to be compatible with their social goals, to be friendly to the planet. Again, clearly an important thing for you to understand. Then the other question is, of all these different requirements, the functional, the emotional, the social, which ones are actually requirements versus which ones are nice to have? They'd like to have this, but maybe they're not essential. And in that spectrum, which ones are really more important versus less important? So there generally are some capabilities that are essential. It has to do at least this. And other capabilities that are maybe nicer to have, but not so essential. You clearly need to understand that requirement versus non-requirement if you're going to understand how likely they are to be able to buy your solution, given the capabilities delivered by your solution. It's also important to understand decision-making roles, especially in a company situation. Different people play different roles in the decision-making process, but this is true for consumer-based sales also. There can be different roles played by different family members in a purchase decision process. But again, the typical model here would be a company where you might have an end user on the one hand that has some input to the process. There's an ultimate decision maker generally. There's typically an economic buyer, maybe a purchasing department, for example. There can often be influencers, people who have input but don't make the decision. There can be recommenders who make recommendations on the solution. And then, of course, you can have saboteurs, people who are not going to win if this purchase actually happens. Maybe their job goes away, for example. So there can be people who really want to sabotage a purchase process. These roles are clearly important to understand. When you're doing your customer interviews, it'll help you interpret what you're hearing from these different people, and that all will then give you more insight into the decision-making process and the criteria. Because again, what you're really trying to understand is what level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction is the limit at which they would consider to buy, and how is the decision-making process and the decision-making roles, how does that all combine to get to that decision? The more you understand, the more insight you'll have as to how much dissatisfaction is too much. And then in a business to business situation, there are additional questions coming down to the department level, the department where the job that you're addressing is actually done. It's good to understand their context, their workflow. What are all of the various jobs that get done in that department? And again, from a priority point of view and a dissatisfaction point of view, how does the job you're addressing stack up with the other jobs that that department is doing? In general, you'll want to ask about what are the challenges that they're facing. One creative way to do that might be to say, hey, if you had $200,000 to improve the processes in this department, how would you spend that money? If they come up with several items and none of them have to do with investing in the job that you're addressing, that tells you something about the priority. On the other hand, if a lot of that funding would go directly into improving the job that you're addressing, well, that's a good sign. That says that maybe indeed that job is top of mind for at least the people in the department. And finally, it's important to ask questions of the interviewee just to understand who it is that you're talking to and what their perspective is. What's their title? What's their actual role in the company? What's their role in the decision-making process when the company is considering a purchase of the kind of product that you anticipate you'll want to sell? What level of authority does this person have to, say, make purchases? How long have they been with the company? Again, there's a lot of context that's important to understand to help you interpret what you're hearing from this interviewee about the company. So that's an overview of some of the topics that you'll want to address in the customer interview. Now, admittedly, that's a lot of potential questions on top of all the questions that you'll be asking to validate your hypotheses around the value proposition and so forth. So you're certainly not going to ask every question of every customer, but you'll certainly want to keep these questions in mind because it's very important to understand whether the customer has a compelling reason to buy. And again, that takes more than just verifying the assumptions that are in your canvas. As I mentioned earlier on, we're putting together a very complete starter list of questions for your customer interview process. If you'd like to get on the list to get that once it's done, there's a link in the notes where you can get to a form to get your name on that list. And aside from that, that's a wrap for our discussion of compelling reason to buy. If this was helpful, please click the like and share it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please click that subscribe button and the reminder bell because we'll have more videos coming up in this series helping you put together a very complete customer interview plan. That's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.